continue, and then you can object if you want to. I mean, I have to get your permission, don't I? Isn't that the way it works?
Yeah, we just have a continue.
Yeah, a little lozenge pops up, and we
okay,
just have to, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I thought that, yeah, the Iggy Pop one, I actually once asked him about Nietzsche. That's the background to that. When the album came out, by some weird set of circumstances, I ended up sitting in a room and he was playing it and we were talking about it. So I asked him if there's Nietzsche was in there. And he said, yeah, but more Dostoevsky.
Yeah. Well, it's got a track called The Idiot, hasn't he?
The album, yeah. But they were hanging around, him and David in Berlin, getting all literary and arty at that point. But it's actually, yeah, I'm looking for some new value. Nothing comes my way. It's almost like from Nietzsche. It's interesting.
Well, when I was listening to lots of Assaulted Stooges this afternoon, I realised how much neg there is in all of their stuff. Everything's just, so, you know, so much ennui, I guess, is the...
Well, they were, yeah, I mean, they were very avant-garde in their early days out in Detroit. They weren't really a punk band at all. They were playing vacuum cleaners and things like that.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
And I mean, Iggy was always quite literary as well. He always read. Oh, that's Dan making noises.
Ah, here's the gangs all here.
Okay, right, I'm going to keep an eye on...
Angel.
Just in case we get invaded by Russian Federation, I'll keep my eye on the waiting room. I mentioned that was really quite striking, put it that way. I don't think we're liable to be trolled, but you never know.
No, I was being very blasé about the idea of being trolled until you told me that.
Well, I was until I saw it, and it was really disruptive, you know. And yeah, and if it had gone on, it would have been extremely unsettling because some of the images they use are really nasty. And,
you should have the ability to throw somebody out.
I can do it, yeah, I can do that.
And you know how to.
No, I don't. I should do. No, not that I've ever had to do that, but how do you do that?
Well, I don't know. I'm just sort of telling you that you should maybe learn.
I probably should. I mean, I use Collaborate for almost all my teaching. I only use Zoom when people, you know, send it to me. I don't really use it that much.
Yeah.
So I need to get to know my way around it. I mean, it's really straightforward, I think, probably. Well, we're almost gathering here. I think it's a respectable number, more or less. Hello, Dan.
Oh, yeah.
How are you doing, Dan?
I'm all right. You've been doing Nora's class, I think, haven't you?
Yes. I saw your big grump about Butler, but all of which was entirely fair dues. I'm with you on that. But we haven't actually had the Butler class yet because this is half term.
Oh, so it's next week, is it?
If you want to veto Butler, you're going to have to do it again next week.
Okay.
Is this cancel culture?
Dan put this whole diatribe in about how real women are paid $2 a month, and you bloody academics, you just talk to other academics.
Right. Well, there's something in that. But then a lot of academics aren't paid very well these days.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Those who haven't got tenure.
Yeah.
Especially in the States. I mean, it's terrible over there. It's much better here, but no, it's appalling. There are quite a few academics.
Done by computers soon, won't it?
Well, yeah. This is it. I mean, all the universities are getting us to record stuff, so they don't need us anymore. They just hand it over to an AI. Maybe. Well, that looks respectable. It's about 5 past, so we might as well kick off, I guess.
Hi, Dawn.
Hi. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
I'm trying to find a pen, so I'm going to disappear for a second.
Sure. You take notes?
Oh, I found it. I'm writing on it. Ah. Right, okay, I'm back.
I'm a great believer in taking notes. All right, so welcome to session 2 of the Introduction to Nietzsche. Last week, as you know, we looked at the birth of tragedy, and I talked a lot about the context and origins of Nietzsche's particular perspective on culture and philosophy. And I'll do a bit more of that today, you know, to give you a sense of his development against the contextual European background of the time. I mean, one of the first things to say is that Nietzsche was a professor at Basel University, or Basel University, very young, made a professor at the age of 24 of philology and classical studies rather than philosophy. And he, Dawn, you got your mic. Yeah. But he was unable to continue. He had to resign after several years as teaching got more and more difficult for him. He suffered from terrible headaches and nausea, and his eyesight was starting to go. He was physically something of a wreck after a few years, and he was still a very young man in his 20s. And eventually it got to the point where he had to give it up. Luckily, he was in a position to have built up enough kudos in the system, and they had a system there to enable him to live off a pension for the rest of his life. He got a small pension from the university, which enabled him to continue to live just about, barely. He wasn't getting a great deal, but he was able to leave Basel and travel. And he spent pretty much the rest of his life traveling, staying in hotels and hostels and pensions, generally around Italy and Switzerland, and arriving in new places as a stranger, as a wanderer, and contemplating what was going on in Europe from that perspective. He had at this point also detached from Wagner. Now, Wagner, as I mentioned last week, is a massive influence on the early Nietzsche. He hero worshipped Wagner initially, basically. And Robert Wagner and Cosima Wagner, his wife, whom Nietzsche almost certainly had some kind of infatuation with. She was a fairly strong woman herself, daughter of Liszt, the composer. They embraced Nietzsche as a brilliant intellectual who could provide the literary and philosophical background to what the Wagners were trying to do with music, with theatre, with art, and with Beirut, this extraordinary complex where they were going to create, enact, express the story, the deep structural story of German myth, and bring it into the modern age via figures like the Nibelung and Tristan and Klingsor from Teutonic and German mythology, which paralleled to some extent Greek mythology. So Nietzsche's work on The Birth of Tragedy had an input into that, and he made it very clear that in some ways The Birth of Tragedy was meant to be a manifesto or declaration in support of Wagner's project. As time passed, though, Nietzsche distanced himself increasingly from the Wagners for a host of reasons. There were differences intellectually, generally, about the purpose of art, fairly rarefied stuff, but there was also the growing awareness on Nietzsche's part of their anti-Semitism. Nietzsche really had no time at all for anti-Semitism. It was completely counter to his philosophy for reasons that will probably, hopefully, become clearer as we move through. But it became impossible for him to really associate with them closely. His closest friend for a while, Paul Ray, was exposed as a Jew by Cosima Wagner at a certain point, which was extremely upsetting, obviously, to Nietzsche, to have that as an issue at all. But this is one reason, but there were several reasons. His illness, his disillusion with the university setup, his disillusion with Wagner meant that after a certain point, he became a wanderer. He had published The Birth of Tragedy to not a massive success, but it certainly sold. And he began to gather readers who were supportive of his ideas across Europe and as far as Russia, and over to some extent in North America as well, who tended not to be professional academics. The scholars on the whole, particularly the classicists, rejected, almost universally rejected what he was saying about Greek thinking at the time. Because if you remember, what he was trying to do was, at least one of the things he was trying to do was portray the crisis of Greek nihilism and its partial solution or resolution through The Birth of Tragedy, through the combination of Apollo and Dionysius, through order and chaos uniting in the form of tragedy, as a response to that nihilism, and suggesting that something similar should be enacted in contemporary Europe or Germany. The philologists, the classicists, were not happy with this. They wanted to keep that past sacred and distant. They didn't want too many comparisons with the present. There was a general perception in Europe as a whole in this period among academics and among the upper classes that the Romans and the Greeks personified the best that culture could arrive at. And the aim of contemporary civilization in Germany and in Britain in particular was to, in some way, reenact that, but in an industrial and technological and imperial age. It was all a fantasy, of course, but it was a very powerful fantasy, and we can still see the legacy of that around in statuary and architecture and writings and songs and history, certainly, particularly in the Victorian period. His version, Nietzsche's version of this, was to completely break with that and to suggest something as alien to the contemporary view as nihilism was actually the inspiration, the catalyst for a new generation of a new Dionysian spirit. Now, there are a lot of things in The Birth of Tragedy that he did pick up on later and continue with, but as time progressed, he distanced himself from it. And one of the main reasons he distanced himself from it was because it for him represented a romantic, as he perceived it, obsession with Wagner and on the one hand, and Schopenhauer, the philosopher Schopenhauer, on the other. He didn't lose his respect entirely for Schopenhauer, but he moved away from Schopenhauer's worldview. And to understand where he was going next, it's probably quite important to just go back a little while and have a look at Schopenhauer and what was important about Schopenhauer to Nietzsche, and subsequently as well. Schopenhauer's a philosopher that maybe not in the sort of top league or division or whatever with people like Hegel or Kant, but he's still very important, and he was very influential on a lot of literary writers. Thomas Hardy, for example, was immersed in him. Wittgenstein was a big fan of Schopenhauer. So there's still a lot of value in Schopenhauer's work, but one particular idea of Schopenhauer's tended to dominate, and this is this philosophy of pessimism. He did have a very pessimistic outlook, Schopenhauer. He was born in what is now Gdansk in Danzig, and back then parts of Poland were parts of Germany, were parts of Prussia. It was a very different kind of organization of cultures. A fairly comfortable background. He's a very irascible man. He was a misogynist. He's not a particularly nice individual, but he did write about things and in ways that nobody had before. And his version of the universe, bouncing off Kant and Hegel, who he hated, was that the world is my representations. This is how he begins his book, which is not actually dissimilar to the beginning of Wittgenstein's Tractatus in a way. The world is my representations. It's all the things I perceive. But beneath that world of representations, there is an essence. What Kant wouldn't allow us to actually perceive directly, the noumenon, for him became the will. It was this gigantic force of will, a metaphysical will, moving forward in time, not towards any particular end, but purely a principle of perseverance and expansion. The blind mechanical will, he called it, at certain points. And it's the relationship we as conscious beings have with the will when we separate ourselves from it to become conscious individuals that determines our experience of that universe.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that?
What, the whole thing?
Just the last few sentences.
Right, okay, did you get to the bit where there's a will, this great big blind mechanical thing passing through the universe? Did you get that bit?
Yeah, that's a bit I don't understand.
All right, okay, let's try that. I'll just let a couple of people in, Niall and others. How best to, well, all right, let's think of a more contemporary version of it. There are quite a few people who work inside biology who would argue that the driving force of life is DNA, yeah, the genes, and there's a certain coding that takes place within our genetic structure, within our DNA or RNA if it's plants, that determines everything that follows. DNA creates proteins and it creates systems of relation between proteins. It creates multicellular organisms. It drives us to live.
Yeah, I don't want to argue with you about biology, but the contemporary idea says that the RNA is actually quite important.
Yeah,
in the way that the genes evolve.
Oh, it is, yeah. I'm not going to argue about the details of biology, but the point is it's a force. This is how it was perceived, and initially anyway. We might not see it that way now. The force of perseverance, that the aim of the selfish gene in Dawkins' term is to just continue itself, to propagate itself, to survive as long as possible and to reproduce itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the will is like that. It's a force that just preserves and recreates itself endlessly into the future.
Okay.
And, you know, Schopenhauer, having sort of established this picture of the universe and what it was, very reductive one, he was also very pessimistic about it because he didn't think there was any meaning to this. And a lot of his observations about the fact that most life is painful for most living creatures, certainly for most human beings. He was very influenced by Buddhism. This is another thing, like the reason that Nietzsche's using Zarathustra is quite significant, because Zarathustra is based on Zoroaster, who was a Persian prophet, Iranian prophet with no say now, but Persian then, who preceded Christianity and Judaism to some extent, and Islam. And there was a massive interest in non-European cultures in Germany in that period. Before that, even Leibniz had got a lot of ideas from the I Ching, for example, which is something you tend to associate with, it's like the tarot now. It's something you'd find in New Age circles probably, but it's very mathematically sophisticated. So Leibniz was borrowing from Chinese thinking. Schopenhauer was borrowing a lot from Indian thinking, Buddhism and Hinduism. And the idea of suffering is really central to Buddhism. When the Gautama Buddha leaves his very, very kind of prosperous background and wanders, what he encounters again and again is suffering. And the central aim of Buddhism is the recognition of the Four Noble Truths, that all is suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire. And then he tries to trace out the ways in which you can ameliorate that desire or escape it if you're sufficiently disciplined by nirvana. But the basic idea is suffering. And suffering is really central to all the major religions in one form or another. The explanation of suffering. Human beings suffer. Yes, we experience pleasure, and sometimes transcendent pleasure, and sometimes ecstasy, certainly. But in the final analysis, suffering seems to be the bottom line. So he takes that from Buddhism and associates it with this kind of post-Kantian will. The will goes nowhere, and along the path of will, once we separate our consciousness from it, we suffer. And so a lot of his thinking was about, what can we do about this? You know, it's very miserable on the whole. But one way out for him was art. He thought creativity, artistic creativity, the aesthetic, was one way in which we could unite with the will in some very important way. Unite the will and its representations. So art was a redemption for Schopenhauer to some degree. And that's really where Nietzsche was coming from. You know, life is bitter and painful and difficult, etc., etc. But tragedy is a particular artistic form that can enable us to create from it. The Dionysian principle, it's creation. Does that make sense?
So the will isn't an individual thing? Like
not in Schopenhauer, no. But the will in Schopenhauer is very different to the will to power, which we'll come to eventually. Nietzsche's separation from Schopenhauer is quite important in that respect. But I won't go there yet. The point I'm making here is his breach with in the Birth of Tragedy, from the Birth of Tragedy on, was with Wagner on the one hand over his various things, anti-Semitism included, and Schopenhauer because he thought he was too romantic. He thought it was a way of giving up. And it was implicit even in the beginning of the Birth of Tragedy, with right at the beginning where you have King Midas encountering the satyr, Silenus, and asking what the purpose of existence is. And Silenus says, rather than dying, it's better to have never been born at all. That to him is the ultimate pessimistic attitude. It's the tragic attitude, which he objects to. He wants an affirmative response to that. He wants a way forward from it. He wants to escape from the nihilism that he perceives in Silenus and Schopenhauer. So what he does next, after Birth of Tragedy, having had a really terrible time in his own life, is he tries to create a path towards affirmation, towards some primal affirmation, which isn't dependent on the structures of culture around him even. It's a very tall order. So he has various writings between the Birth of Tragedy and Zarathustra. It's only a few years. Quite a lot of short writings, because his headaches are getting worse and he's feeling sicker and sicker, and he's not able to write long things anymore. He starts to write in aphorisms. He starts to write in paragraphs and short sections. And this is why his style is the way it is. But not only does he do that, he thinks about it, he contemplates it, he commentates on it. And there was one thing I put up online on Reading and Writing from Zarathustra, where he talks about the aphoristic style, which is really present. I should probably read it to you. In the things that come in between human, all too human, and the gay science in particular. If I can find it. Right with blood, blah, 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 blah. Oh, I'll find it after the break anyway. But it's all about the nature of the aphoristic style and how it allows for a certain kind of creativity, which is distinct from the linear creativity of the ordinary philosophical argument anyway. And he produces these books, none of which sell very well. The Birth of Tragedy sold reasonably well, but Human All Too Human, Untimely Meditations, which is a collection of essays, and The Gay Science. None of them sell particularly well, but amazingly he keeps on producing. While he's traveling from hotel to hotel, increasingly lonely and isolated a lot of the time, although he does have friends, he's increasingly alone, increasingly in pain, producing this stuff. And the road he's traveling on will eventually lead to madness. It's a very bitter existence. And this is perhaps what is one of the things that's very important about Nietzsche. He grasps this rather than giving up, rather than running away from it. He actually grasps it and decides to turn that into something positive philosophically. So for the future of ethics in particular, he is very important in that respect. Now, The Gay Science, I think, is probably my favorite Nietzsche. It's a collection of aphorisms and ideas, many of which recur later in his later work. And really, it's, you know, you got it in a PDF, and if you haven't read it, it's well, you don't read it from cover to cover, you just dip into it and so on. But a lot of the ideas that become predominant in his later phase, from Zarathustra onwards, are implicit in that. And what I want to do in this, you know, first hour anyway, is look at a couple of those, and then in the second part talk about Zarathustra itself. Before I do that, though, in Zarathustra, I don't know. I mean, some of you have read it, some of you won't have read it. I don't know. Hang on, let a couple of people in. They don't look like Russian Federation. I mean, I don't know what people think of it, people who try to read it, and any, you know, thoughts or feelings or whatever about Zarathustra?
I listened to the first hour of the audiobook.
Okay, and what do you think?
That's quite a long audiobook you put up. 10 hours long, I think.
Oh, yeah. So why write such long books?
I mean, to cracking these. It's like right at the front. It'll probably write itself. Just be careful when you're driving.
Well, okay. I mean, look, you hang on. Someone's got a mic on. I think. Right. Got some background noise. Great. Yeah. I mean, it's very. Well, I don't know. His style changes as he progresses. In a way, Zarathustra, someone described it as it's prog rock moment in a way. It's full of, you know, riddlers and tightrope walkers and jesters and despisers of the body and spiders. You know, yeah. It's full of bizarre imagery, really.
Well, it's very elliptical in a way.
Yeah,
like it's often very elusive, and it's not necessarily easy to follow what he's getting at in the same way perhaps you might get in something like The Gay Science, or maybe even Human All Too Human. That is my memory of it, having read it many years ago. So yeah.
Well, generally The Gay Science, and most of his books actually, you get a short section and it makes sense, but sometimes he gets a bit allegorical. But you can kind of understand the symbolism. But with Zarathustra, some of it is straightforward allegory, some of it is just weird. You know, I'll go through the story at the beginning when, you know, this guy comes down from a mountain, starts to spout on about supermen to a bunch of people who don't want to listen to him, then carries a corpse out of town, you know. This is the beginning of the book. How strange is that? But we'll go into the detail of that a bit later. I mean, first of all, the stuff that occurs in The Gay Science, which is then developed in Zarathustra, and to some extent in Human All Too Human, there are certain ideas which are really predominant for Nietzsche generally. The one is the declaration, God is dead and we have killed him, which of course Nietzsche was very renowned for. And the other is probably the central doctrine of all Nietzsche's thinking, which is the doctrine of eternal recurrence and whatever that might mean. So in a way, it's probably a good idea to spend a few minutes just thinking about those ones within the context in which we find them. And I mean, the God is dead thing takes place in the marketplace. It often takes place in marketplaces. It's kind of interesting, this. The beginning of Zarathustra, when he actually, after he talks to the hermit, he goes into the town. It's called the Motley Cow or the Pied Cow, depending on you translate it, which again is quite prog rock, isn't it? The jester with bells and things. Nietzsche did have a bit of a thing about cows, there's no doubt about it. And, you know, we'll come back to what that actually means in due course. But what takes place in the marketplace. And in The Gay Science, we have a madman announcing the death of God, and this might be significant. So I'm just going to read this to you. Gay Science 125, The Madman. Haven't you heard of that madman who in the bright morning lit a lantern and ran around the marketplace crying incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. Since many of those who did not believe in God were standing around together just then, he caused great laughter. Has he been lost then? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone to sea, emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed, one interrupting the other. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling, and backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? Hasn't it got colder? Isn't night and more night coming again and again? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning? Do we still hear nothing of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? And so it goes on. Do we still smell of nothing of the divine decomposition? Gods do decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. And so it goes on. This kind of rolls on and on. This kind of endless litany of questions and imagery about the dead gods. And you could easily look at that and think, well, this is just kind of almost like a schizo rambling. And in a sense, perhaps it is, but there is meaning in it. And this is the thing I've found more and more over the many decades I've been reading Nietzsche, that whenever you think you've got on top of Nietzsche, then you read him closely and you realize there's a hell of a lot more going on, you know, between the sentences in many ways than you initially supposed. But this preempts the a parallel scene in Zarathustra, and in a way I prefer it. There's slight differences here. I mean, for a start, it's a madman that declares the death of God. The townsfolk are not particularly interested because it is claimed, it's suggested anyway, that there's nothing particularly controversial about this. But why do you think Nietzsche chose to have a madman declaring this? Do you think that could have been significant?
That's because so in Orthodox tradition, they did not believe that God is dead. You know, there's a kind of orthodoxy which believes. I mean, I suppose was he trying to say that we've moved away from a kind of central faith or tradition? We don't have the comfort of that anymore. I mean, he mentions the earth being unchained from the sun, the whole sort of Copernican thing, the science. Yeah. You know, moving away from an idea that we're at the center of the universe.
Yeah,
a humanist tradition, perhaps. So humanist or religious orthodox. So why he's got a madman saying that, I don't know, because it sort of suggests that a madman wouldn't be believed. That it's a crazy thing to say. Only a madman would say it. I'm not sure why.
No, that's good. I mean, you're right. Like all the stuff about the infinite universe and the sun's moving away is Nietzsche is riddled with this. It's referential. Yes, it is about Copernicus. I think was it Kant or Freud? Well, Kant talks about the Copernican revolution. There's been various Copernican revolutions in Western humanism. You know, the Western European view of the move away from being a God-centered universe, a theocentric universe, to an anthropocentric universe centered on the human. And there are certain points in that history. And Copernicus' statement that the sun is the center of the solar system rather than the earth was a very significant moment in that process. It decenters us from the center of things. Now, I mean, Copernicus wasn't the first person to announce this, but it was kind of forgotten for 2,000 years. But in doing that, of course, many astronomers were persecuted by the church for a while and so on and so forth. But that decentering was really important. Then in Nietzsche's personal vision of things, Kant comes along and decenters us even further. You know, it's no longer human beings who decide what reality is, who understand it even. We float around in the sea of phenomena. We have no access to reality. And Nietzsche decenters us, and then later on Freud and Darwin both decenter us too. Darwin decenters us by no longer making us the most important creature in the planet even. There's no longer a hierarchy, a pyramid that we're on top of. If you're reading Darwin properly anyway, because a lot of people misread Darwin, including Nietzsche, it has to be said.
It sounds very,
yeah.
Sorry.
Go on.
It sounds very Buddhist almost, the way he was describing endless worlds and worlds moving apart, and that it's nothingness. We're all in a sea of nothingness.
Yeah.
That's a very Buddhist way of looking at things.
It is. I mean, there's an influence of Buddhism indirectly via Schopenhauer, there's no doubt. But also it's a reading of the Epicureans, the Epicurean tradition, Epicurus and Lucretius, who that tradition believed, as Democritus, the first atomist and the first Epicurean in a sense, said, there are only atoms in the void, and that's all there is. You know, there was this vision that Epicurus put forward in the late kind of Greek period, that the universe was infinite, there were infinite universes and worlds, and there was no center to the universe at all. And everything else was nothingness. So he's drawing on that tradition as well, which, you know, I mean, there have been lots of scholarly debates about whether there was some kind of, you know, meeting between thinkers like Epicurus and certain Eastern thinkers, and there probably was a lot of communication of ideas going on 2,000 years ago along the trade routes. It's quite believable. But the ideas themselves certainly permeate Nietzsche's thinking. It's an example of a nihilism. If the universe doesn't have this center, that comforting illusion of God being in charge, then suddenly we're thrown into a void, in a sense. And these people in the marketplace, they don't seem to care. And this is the thing that I guess Nietzsche's making a point about. You know, why don't they care? This is actually quite important, right?
Can I say something?
Yeah, go on, Maria. Go ahead.
Well, in a way, I mean, from a Christian point of view, we did kill God, didn't we? Because Jesus was crucified.
Yeah, but resurrected.
Yes, but that's what we did when God came to earth. We killed him. Yeah, that's right. Well, thereby hangs a lot of tales. It's very complicated. Like that, all the kind of early heresy in Christianity was about whether Christ, as part of God, actually suffered, or was he just pretending to. There's a heresy called Docetism, which claimed that, and they were all kind of like persecuted, of course. And whether, you know, the three in one, the Trinity, it gets really complicated. But the symbolism is important, that at some level anyway, after the Council of Nicaea in 431 or whatever, it was established that God set down a part of himself that was symbolically sacrificed to account for our sins. So in that sense, we killed God. But Nietzsche's making a bigger claim than that. Not just that one part of the Trinity was killed, all of it, the whole God, the idea of God. And what's important also is that it's, I mean, do you think he's saying that God never existed at all? Or is he just saying that he didn't and doesn't now? What's your impression of that?
I think he's saying that he never existed at all.
Yeah. All right. Dan? Yeah. Anyone else? You're going to say something, Mohammed?
I think maybe there
Alan?
was.
Yeah. Someone disappeared just then. So I lost you.
Press the button.
I think we lost the connection. Helen? No.
Oh yeah. Hi.
Oh yeah.
Can
Hi.
you
Are you
hear
there?
me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go on.
No. Okay. All right. Maybe it was around the time when people started thinking more scientifically rather than mythologically. You know, like maybe the ideas of magic were sort of falling away in some ways, like that sort of those sorts of ideas.
That's certainly happening, yeah. I mean, in that position, from the Enlightenment, the age of reason and so on, which came before, the 19th century is the age of science, when science really comes into its own. And there's this whole philosophy associated with science called positivism. And positivism, in essence, is really only concerned with mechanical relations. If you can't perceive it, measure it, it doesn't really exist, or it doesn't matter anyway. So there's certainly that going on. And there's really no room in pure science for God. Now, it doesn't mean some scientists weren't religious, because quite a few of them were, and spent a lot of time trying to marry these two very different worldviews together with varying degrees of success. But yeah, science is part of it. Science is one thing that began the process of killing gods. I mean, I don't know, the question is, the madman declares that we killed God, which means that God existed. But the implication is that God existed as a figment of our projection, imagination. And in that, he's drawing on a previous philosopher called Feuerbach, who was very important for Marx as well.
Who was it, sorry?
Feuerbach.
Oh, Feuerbach,
Yep, Feuerbach. Yeah. And Feuerbach's argument that basically all religious belief was a projection from us. You know, we made it up. You know, God didn't create us, we created God, which now wouldn't be that controversial in most secular circles, but then it was. So yeah, he's playing around with the idea that, yeah, we created God, then we killed him. Which is
I think the madman in when he initially comes into the marketplace, the madman is showing signs of separation anxiety. Where is he? You know,
that's true. Yeah.
Where is God? Where is God? He's desperate, and it's a little bit like having a child that's lost the parent.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And I think maybe Nietzsche is saying that when you lose your faith in God, which is what happened to me when I was in my teens, I lost my very deep faith in God. You feel abandoned, you feel bereft, and it can send you mad. That's
really interesting. I think
and plunge you into this state of despair and nihilism, which it did to me for a few years.
I second that.
And I think Nietzsche is telling us about this form of suffering. And I think it's not. It must have been less unusual in those days, because I think nowadays a lot of people are kind of brought up atheist, but at a time when a lot of people were brought up to be deeply religious, and then you lose your faith, you reason yourself out of your faith.
It was harder to talk about and share. It was now anyone would go online and do it. Back then, you could be quite isolated if you adopted that position too. Go on, Helen.
Charlie. Yeah. Could you just explain a little bit more about what will is? What Schopenhauer meant by will?
I'll come back to that actually, Helen, because I want to move on, but we'll come back to will when we do the will to power. At this stage, it's probably best concentrate on God, and then we'll come back to will. These are big things.
The death of God that he declared.
Death of God, yeah.
Was there something that he was declaring in an absolute sense, like we said earlier, the 19th century and the movements of science that erased God? Or is it something that he perhaps saw as it's like a temporary thing? There've been Egyptians who had gods and they were eclipsed, by gods who took over from the previous ones. They were erased, if you like, and then you had maybe in other parts of the world you had Romans and Greeks and Romans. You had gods, and they were also taken over. So is it more like a temporary thing that?
That leads to all kinds of things. Yes, that's certainly true, because he talks elsewhere about God may be dead, but the shadow prevails. And there was a legend in Buddhism that when the Buddha died, his shadow stayed on the wall of a cave he was in for generations, right? And he takes this idea and plays around the idea of the shadow of God persisting. And he's also concerned that God may reappear in another form, which could be science, it could be democracy, it could be socialism. It moves around all over the place, or it could be fascism. But the last part of this section is interesting, because when he says, God remains dead and we have killed him, how can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood from us? With what water can we cleanse ourselves? What festivals atonement? What holy games will we have to invent for ourselves? Is the magnitude of this deed not too great for us? And he goes on like that for a while and says, here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They too were silent and looked at him disconcertedly. Finally, he threw down his lantern on the ground, so it broke into pieces and went out. I come too early, he then said. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder need time. The light of the stars needs time. Deeds needs time, even after they are done, in order to be seen and heard. And this is quite important, because he's saying, which is more or less reiterated by Zarathustra in the Zarathustra, that it's not time yet. God is dead and we have killed him is an announcement, but we haven't killed God. I mean, this is the kind of implication. And yet there are some who may argue that we still haven't, that God is still haunting us, those who are not into God, put it that way anyway. So, So the breaking of the lantern, I mean, the lantern in the daylight is, you know, odd. Why would you be walking around with a lantern in the middle of the day anyway? And what does it mean that you broke the lantern? I don't know, it invites all kinds of possibilities, but yeah.
Light of faith, perhaps?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But lightning is quite important as well, and lightning is another kind of light, because Zarathustra appears as lightning, becomes lightning. Well, not Zarathustra himself, but the Übermensch that will come later when the Übermensch arrives. And this is partly what this is about. The death of God makes way for the Übermensch. And this is where Nietzsche gets very complicated. The Superman or Overman is now usually translated as Übermensch because it's not gendered in the same way. And it's more accurate, just say Übermensch. And also Superman got all mixed up with Clark Kent in people's imaginations, which is not to mention Nazis, you know, it's all a bit complicated. But we'll get to that bit. I mean, you know, here's a tightrope walker in the Zarathustra scene, but significant then, the death of God is about that. It's about also something else that will preoccupy him a great deal later, which is the negative effect that Christianity has had on being human, all too human, and how it's important to separate ourselves from Christianity. I mean, this is also very complex, because clearly when the fascists came along, because of Nietzsche's sister gathering, as I said, certain bits of Nietzsche and putting them together for presentation for Hitler, the anti-Christian thing was allied to anti-Jewish thing, anti-Judeo-Christian thing. And things were taken out of context from Nietzsche to justify the kind of horrors that we know happened subsequently. But Nietzsche's anti-Christianity isn't like that. When you look at it, it's more purely represented in later on in the Antichrist, which I'll come to in a few weeks' time. But he's concerned with the way in which Christianity has made us weak by positing another world. And again, this is something that begins to stir in The Birth of Tragedy. When he talks about Socrates, Socrates for him represents the birth of Western philosophy and thinking that then allies itself to Christianity, in as much as all of these ways of thinking posit that we live in a reflection of something far greater. There is a far greater other world, whether it's Plato's world of forms or Christianity's eternity in which God prevails, and parallel eternities that might exist in Judaism and Islam, although they have different kind of angles and connotations. But this idea of otherworldliness, which he hits very hard in Zarathustra, is part of this, because it's attached to the existence of God. God is a kind of signifier that justifies this otherworldliness. We no longer live here. We live in our heads somewhere else. We live for an undetermined future or a greater other place, which for him is a kind of weakness. We are rejecting the body. We are rejecting the world because of its horrors, because of its sufferings. And we're running away to a fantasy, in effect. And God symbolizes that fantasy and represents it. So this is one of the first things that he or his characters ask us to embrace, is the only way out of nihilism, the only way out of the fear of absolute nothingness, which permeates so much of his work, is to accept the reality of the here and now, accept the body and accept the earth as being all there is.
I had a quick burst of the genealogy of moles.
Oh, how was that then done?
Well, he's very down on pity and mercy, isn't
he? Yeah, he is, yeah.
Do you know why?
Compassion. It's very odd, because it's not completely, not always, and he's not consistent. I mean, that's the first thing to say. It's like his attack on Christianity, his attacks on Christianity. It's always quite crucial to separate his attack on Christianity from his relationship with a figure like Jesus. Jesus Christ, he has a great respect for. Christianity, he doesn't, and that's because of St. Paul, who establishes Christianity as an ideology of the weak, effectively, in his eyes. For him, Christ's compassion and mercy came from strength, whereas the way Paul reconfigured it became a kind of weakness and pity and negativity. But yes, you have to say that Nietzsche is fairly inconsistent about this. In general, he seems to have contempt for compassion and pity. And
since we've been doing this, I've been wondering, how far back his madness really goes.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of biographical stuff on Nietzsche, obviously. He grew up in his father was a Lutheran priest, which is possibly significant, and died quite young, comparatively. And, Nietzsche completely abandoned that Lutheran background, which his mother retained, and possibly his sister to an extent, until she went to fascism. So the religious side of it is quite crucial. And he associates a lot of those ideas of pity and compassion with hypocrisy, to be honest, which is possibly a fair accusation to make against quite a few strands of Christianity.
He was against, like you say, against the idea of an other world, another world, like turning away from this world in the hope of something that's not visible, but hope that we might enter that better world. So he's against that idea. Then I wonder whether he was also against Christianity as a religion of something that supports people who the meek and the mild shall gain heaven. So he's against that. It's like the religion supports the idea that the poor, the downtrodden will enter heaven. It's just not true. The way of the world is some people are better off, some people are worse off, and that's just the way that things are. But he was perhaps saying to accept that.
Well, this is it. It's a central dilemma for 19th century, how to deal with the masses, the herd, the crowd. And, whether it's Marx or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, they all have their own angle on this, or Das Man, as Heidegger later describes it. And a lot of it does come from Paul. It is what's revolutionary, really, in world terms about Christianity, and particularly about Paul, is it's the first time that we're aware of that the idea of embracing the weak and the humble is central. There's no other religion or philosophy that does that. Slavery, the Christianity is a complex relationship with slavery anyway, but the general view was, yes, people are unequal and it's tough shit, basically. That's the way you are. If you get out of it, good luck, but there's no justice, there's no fairness, really. And the Greeks tried to set up courts of fairness, and they tried to work out ways of establishing justice in relation to all kinds of complex systems like music and Pythagoras and so on. But in the main, there is no justice. There's a battle of supernatural forces that you're just subject to. And again, Zoroaster is important here, Zarathustra, in as much as the Zoroastrianism is the first major world religion it's not monotheistic, it's duotheistic. There's a good and evil, and they're both in competition. And there is no necessary way in which the good will always prevail. So there's a separation there, but we are the subjects of that. And Greek mythology and Roman mythology and German mythology was no different. As Shakespeare put it, as flies we are to wanton boys, they kill us for their sport in King Lear. We are nothing to the gods. The gods have games, they're capricious. They might trample us one day, they might torture us the next, they might give us blessings the next, but there's no logic.
But the answer to that might be to set up organizations and institutions in such a way that they raise up people who are down in the pit, down in the...
leveling up. That's Boris Johnson, isn't it?
Is what, sorry?
Boris Johnson's leveling up.
Boris Johnson leveling up. Well, I was thinking more, socialism perhaps, or...
Yeah. Well, in a sense, Christianity began to do that after Paul, and this is it. Paul is such a complex and interesting figure. Nietzsche absolutely rejects him, but he's been taken on by certain Marxist thinkers like Zizek and Badiou, who see in him a kind of a precursor to universal world socialism. That's certainly true, although it's never that simple. But yeah, he does venerate the humble and the weak. And in doing that, and as we see in the genealogy of morality later, he creates this whole model, or begins this whole moral system, whereby the weak have precedence. And
I think Nietzsche sort of put Paul down because of his conversion, on the road to Damascus. And that it was some kind of revolution in his mind, that the way to gain some kind of significance for himself was to reevaluate everything and to actually look at the humble and the poor and raise them up rather than some other route or some other.
Yeah, it was a revolutionary thing to do, and there's so much comes out of it, and so Nietzsche's attack on it has to come from some perspective, and And this is when you get into Nietzsche's politics and the complexity of the great politics and aristocratic radicalism, so-called, which has had such a mixed reception. And of course, you know, as I mentioned last week, when Nietzsche was first embraced by radicals, it was the left, it was feminism and socialism that embraced him, it wasn't the right. Nietzsche was never really embraced by conservatives or even liberals. He's too complex and difficult for that. And there are elements of his thinking which some would argue establish a purer or more authentic form of socialism. I mean, this is what we'll be doing in a few weeks' time, looking at that stuff. But yeah, there's no doubt that the Pauline moment was a big problem for Nietzsche because of what he perceived it as leading to, which was an indulgence of the crowd, of the herd, a lowering of general cultural standards, a flattening out.
Nietzsche wasn't the first person to doubt the existence of God, was he?
Oh, no.
In 1649, the Levellers, after the English Civil War, they felt that they were kept in chains by the aristocracy, obviously, and also by the religions that kept them. You know, they were subjects.
Yeah. There've been outbursts of revolutionary atheism in various parts of Western history. Definitely, it was very, very rare for a long time because it was easily punished and generally very viciously punished. And the worldview was such that even like if you go back to the 17th century, someone like Thomas Hobbes, who was a very important philosopher, was probably an atheist but didn't dare state it.
Yeah.
You know, to state that would be, you know, destroy you. Descartes kept a lot of his ideas to himself for that reason. And Descartes probably wasn't an atheist, but he was near enough to it for a lot of people. So was Spinoza. So no, Nietzsche wasn't the first atheist in that sense. And I'm not sure if he even is an atheist, really, because
Charlie, can I ask you if Nietzsche's brother was around when he wrote
Nietzsche's brother? No, Nietzsche's brother.
So he was a pastor as well, wasn't he?
Nietzsche's brother died young.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There was only really the sister after a certain point, and the mother, and then, you know. I mean, this is another thing. Like when you get into the biography of Nietzsche, it's very complicated. He had a very difficult relationship with his sister, and for a very long time, it was put out that he had an incestuous relationship with her, and it turned out there were a whole load of forgeries around this that created this strange image. I think Nietzsche's sexuality was always an object of some interest to people.
I think
Go on.
Wagner once commented that he was self-loving, to use the euphemism, a bit too much.
Well, this thing. One of the reasons for the breach with Wagner, supposedly, it wasn't so much anti-Semitism; it's about masturbation. Because Wagner became convinced that the reason he was going blind and, you know, having all these problems because he was an obsessive masturbator. Whether he was or not, I don't know, but quite possibly. But this was, there was an exchange with Nietzsche's doctor between him and Wagner. And then eventually that went public and Nietzsche was absolutely outraged. You can kind of understand why in a way. But so, maybe, I mean, I'm sure, onanism was not beyond him. I mean, there is a suggestion that he may have been gay. It's possible. Who knows? But he ended up basically asexual in terms of his life.
He had an unhappy relationship with a woman, didn't he?
All of his relationships with women were unhappy.
Did he have more? I thought he only had one real.
He didn't have any real relationship in the end. No, I mean he fell deeply in love with Lou Salome.
Yeah,
and as did a lot of people. You know, she was a bit like that, a bit of a femme fatale, especially intellectual men from Rilke and Freud, and you know they all did. But she wasn't interested in him anyway.
It's interesting.
Sorry. Go on. No.
It's interesting that he was brought up as under the wing of the auspices of a sort of Lutheran household, which would have been very strict, and then maybe, I don't know, but later on, going back to what you were saying about his politics, I always thought that his feeling about not putting down the humble and compassion and so on, that was. His politics was, he believed in, like you said, the aristocracy, the aristocratic ideals, and using strength in a way, might and power to keep a hold of society, to control society. So I think he was quite into like Machiavelli or the Prince, or
He did say some things about Machiavelli, but I mean, with aristocracy, it's important to think what he means by that, because he wasn't into the inherited aristocracy idea, which is generally what we think of. You inherit a baroncy because your dad was a baron. It came from the Greek term aristos, which you find in Heraclitus, the pre-Socratics, and he loved Heraclitus. And it means excellence. It's a bit like Arete and Aristotle, but something else. It's about a personal power and a social power, which is also an intellectual power that emanates from discipline. So Aristos, for him, aristocracy is an aristocracy of the spirit, rather than aristocracy of birth, put it that way. Yes. But it is about a certain kind of individualism, and it's painted in the landscape of mountains. He likes his ideas of peaks and things like that. So there are some people, to some extent, it could be viewed as meritocratic, but he would have dismissed that idea, because meritocracy becomes something other. But this idea of the great human being, and usually almost always the great man in this period, with the possible exception of Joan of Arc, there aren't too many females who are venerated in that way. You find it in Thomas Carlyle in this country as well.
John Fowles wrote a book called The Aristos.
He did indeed, yeah. John Fowles is a funny bloke, and he had some strange ideas.
I think when I came in, you were talking about Dostoevsky.
Yeah, that was because of Iggy Pop.
Yeah, were you sort of drawing some? Oh, it's purely because of Iggy Pop.
Yeah, it was about new values, because I put it up there, and his interest in Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. It's just an illustration.
You think about Raskolnikov. His idea that great men like Napoleon do. This is very much like, to me at least, very much like the Nietzschean.
Well, Nietzsche was a massive fan of Dostoevsky. He didn't actually read him till quite late, but as soon as he did, he immediately clicked and said, "Yeah, this is my forerunner."
I mean,
one of them.
That just seems too striking to be a coincidence to me.
Well, I mean, he may have got some ideas like later from that, but yeah, he probably read The Idiot first, and then Karamazov. I don't know. He may have read Crime and Punishment then, I'm not sure. I think the first one he read was what's it called? Sometimes the one about House of the Dead, the one about the when he was in an internment camp. Dostoevsky for quite a while.
I think Daniel's got a point though about how in Raskolnikov, the Crime and Punishment, he talks about the man of brass. The Napoleonic figure who can, by his will, by his ability to impose his will on others, he is like a Superman, like somebody who affects something in the world. And it's almost as if it's connected to Nietzsche, it's saying that doing something, whether it's good or whether it's evil as well, is better than just indifference, just not doing anything. Even T.S. Eliot said something like that. It's better to do something, on balance. If you do something as evil, which I don't know where to stand with that, really, to be honest.
Well,
Eliot was pretty right wing as well, wasn't he?
Well, he was, yeah. But no, the shadow of Napoleon is cast over the whole of the 19th century in European culture. He's a massive figure. And what he did was extraordinary. There's no doubt about it. And he's a very mixed figure in terms of what he achieved and where he went with it. But yes, everyone who writes about stuff like that is haunted by Napoleon. Somebody who came from a very ordinary background and completely transformed Europe. And Hitler was clearly infatuated as well. And then in the background, there's people like Charlemagne, these great heroes of European culture. But also via Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle wrote Heroes and Hero Worship in the, I think, 1820s. It was published. Nietzsche knew that. And, he writes about the heroes of war and heroes of religion, as well. So he has someone, Muhammad is in there as well, as a representative of the great man transforming culture. Yeah, and Nietzsche certainly drew on that idea. No,
Tolstoy didn't think too much of Napoleon, I don't think.
No. Well, yeah, Napoleon did some dodgy things too. Anyway, I think it's time for a break. It's 8 o'clock, so can we have 10 minutes?
Great.
I'll just go and rest my voice and get a cup of tea. And I'll see you at 10 past, okay? Oops.
I don't know. No.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Oh, you are there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got a limited broadband.
Why is that?
Just too many people on there using the.
Oh, right.
How you doing?
Yeah, good.
So you been out much, or?
I haven't been doing much, to be honest.
How's your eyes?
Oh, about the same. Got a lot to tell you about when I see you next time. Yeah, from McGarry.
Yeah, briefly. Just saying, when do you want to? Should we get out for a drink?
Well, we had that idea, and then it didn't come to pass, did it? For some reason.
Yeah, but no point giving up.
No, so.
No, I was thinking next week maybe when it's when we got the choice. If the weather's not that great, we can go inside.
Is it next week? Let's start opening.
Yeah, Monday. From Monday.
Right. Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of that.
Pubs.
Yeah. I've been out a little bit. I went to Lewis's today.
On your bike?
No, I got the train over.
Oh, right. What'd you go there for? Anything special?
My daughter wanted to go, so she was back from London.
Where'd you go? The castle?
Just walked around a bit.
There's not much to it. There's only the high street, really, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. You can get into the history. She wasn't too bothered about it. You know, the barons and the De Montforts and all that stuff.
Did you go in the castle?
Well, no.
Have you been in that?
Never.
Oh, it's worth a look if you've not been in.
Yeah. I don't know that at the moment you can go in or not.
Oh, I don't know. That's true.
Yeah. And then I think before, you used to charge to go in, and there was always lots of people queuing up when I used to see it.
Right. Maybe it's better to go in the winter.
Yeah, probably.
What about the libraries? Are they opening up anytime soon?
I think the libraries are open actually, but I think what they're doing is like alternate days. I think they're open now. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's good to
know.
know.
No, they definitely are, because I looked the other day.
Brilliant. I've been meaning there's some books I want to get out. While you're there, you said you would pass on to me.
Hi, Maria.
Confederacy of
Dunces.
Dunces, yeah.
Yeah, we'll do. I forgot.
Oh, that'd be good. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll dig it out because I've got lots of books at the moment that I'm trying to clear out stuff. So I was thinking of giving them to the guy in the market.
Yeah.
And I maybe just to Amnesty, but you can have a look, definitely, or anybody else.
Oh, that nice one.
Yeah.
Because I suppose I think so. I've wanted to read that for quite a while and just haven't got around to it.
Yeah, it's good. It's a bit slow by today's sort of reading, but
when did it come out? 40s.
Maybe the 50s or something like that. I'm not sure.
I'd lost my copy of the Dubliners, so I found a new copy of that.
Yeah.
Been reading that. But I happened to get, for some reason, I haven't bought Private Eye for ages, but I got this month's. And did you get it?
Yeah, I think so. If it's the same one.
I haven't read it yet, but it's got the Boris Johnson CCJ in it, apparently. Criminal Court, County Court Judgment.
No, but it must be the one before I got. Yeah. I think with the cover is "I'll Do Anything for Money" with Prince Philip and David Cameron.
Oh, right, that's last month. I think, yeah. This one's got two Godzillas fighting, and it's supposed to be like Johnson and Cummings.
No, I've not seen it.
All right, but you heard about the County Court Judgment, did you?
Only today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's
nonsense, isn't it, though?
Huh?
Isn't it nonsense?
Is it nonsense?
Yeah, I don't know. I thought I heard it sort of people just saying, "No, it's just
CCJ against Boris Johnson." Is it?
Yeah, it's the news today apparently.
Some people are saying it's a prank. I don't know.
Oh, really? Right. I hadn't heard about that. It's come out today.
I wouldn't put anything past that guy.
And what's the substance of it? What's the reason for it?
They haven't published that. They've just said that it's on public record. It's got a CCJ against him.
Dirty laundry has come to mind.
That means the bailiffs could go into Downing Street, doesn't it?
I don't know excuse me, I don't know the protocol on that, to be honest.
Yeah, but he's in a position to wipe it out. That's the weird thing about the British non-constitution. Yeah. He has the powers of the monarch, basically. Yes. Anyway, shall we resume? Right. Yeah. All right. To resume a resume. Yeah. Human, all-too-human, and gay science. That period, the middle period, so-called, is a phase when Nietzsche is arguably moving from his early romanticism to some more mature philosophy, which perhaps in his view the pinnacle is the Zarathustra book. For him, it was his most important book, and in general, in terms of reception, it's tended to be more popular amongst literally inclined readers than philosophers per se. It doesn't have the kind of economy of some of his later works, put it that way. But it is interesting that Nietzsche's reception we'll deal with after we've had the break in the middle more. But he has been taken up quite ardently by analytic philosophers as well as continental philosophers. He has spanned this divide fairly successfully, but really not with the Zarathustra book, which has tended to be complex because its language is so obscure and its references are extremely obscure. And I don't know, if you get into the rhythm of it and you get into the strangeness of it, it works, I think. And I hadn't read it for several decades, I think, but it was the first Nietzsche I read. And at the time I was an adolescent and I was extremely impressed with it for all kinds of adolescent reasons. And now I thought initially, maybe I'm not so impressed with it, but actually as I've gone on through it, I am. And for very different reasons. There are depths to it. It's like traveling through a very odd landscape. that's full of surprises, and some of them are quite alien, and some of them are familiar by virtue of being alien. It's very hard to summarize in that sense.
The language is quite beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very poetic.
Very poetic, definitely. Well, look, next week we're going to be doing, what did I call it? Why I'm So Clever, I think I called it next one, which is from obviously taken from Nietzsche. I'm not talking about myself, but it's from his final book, Ege Helmo, and it's a kind of the nearest thing he did to an autobiography, that book. And it's definitely worth reading if you like Nietzsche. But the issue of language is foregrounded there, and we will be looking more at language and style next week. Now, obviously, we're not doing this in German, and it would be different, but there are certain important things we can still take from it in translation. I don't know, those of you who have looked at it recently, that there's an awful lot of stuff about going over and going under, and going up and going down. A lot of locutions, put it that way. Words connected with direction and movement. And this is actually quite significant. There's very little that isn't significant in the way Nietzsche uses language, in fact, and this has been the bane of translators, obviously, for a very long time. But I think, you know, the more recent translations are certainly, I'm told, very good by Germanists who know their stuff. But yeah, where do we go with Zarathustra? Well, the name itself, as I said, is based on the figure of Zoroaster, as this other one is known as the first significant, I guess, Messiah figure in Western thinking, and also for Nietzsche, the creator of morality, because it's Zoroaster or Zarathustra who announces this division of the universe into good and evil and gives human beings a choice within it. So the concept of free will starts to emerge as well, rather than merely being the sort of footballs of you know, kind of playful gods or flies for wanton boys. We actually have some kind of choice to select the good or the bad, and to follow the light of Ahura Mazda or the darkness of Ahriman, who are the kind of the god and the devil of this particular perception.
Who's the devil?
Ahriman or Ahriman, there are various names. But yeah, it's not the devil. I mean, the devil is a later creation building on Ahriman, but a power of evil, basically, of badness. Whereas Ahura Mazda is the light. Mazda light bulbs were named after. I don't know if anyone remember Mazda light bulbs, but he is the god of light. And it's a fire religion, and Zoroastrianism has pretty much died out. I mean, the only modern Zoroastrian of any fame is Freddie Mercury from Queen. He was raised as a Zoroastrian, strangely. But there's not many of them left. Parsis, Zoroastrians. It evolved into, joined with Judaism, and you know, came into Christianity and so on. But there was something of an obsession with, as I said, Orientalism as it later became known in Germany at the time. There was a fascination with India, China, and what was then Persia, and what was then called the Middle East. And this whole idea of Near East, Far East, and Middle East is clearly a symptom of the times that we still use. But Persia in particular, which of course changed its name to Iran, which is an old Persian word, which is very similar to Aryan. And there were actually reasons for that, because Persia was in communication with Germany at the time that the name Iran actually was arrived at. So there's been a long connection between Persia and Germany anyway, in all kinds of ways, or Persia and Iran and Germany. So it would have been somewhat familiar to his more educated readers, you know, this figure of Zarathustra. But he was sufficiently distant and previous to Christianity to be used and reinvented in a way that was useful for Nietzsche's project. And there are certain characteristics of this figure that clearly connote or connect with other religious prophets of various kinds. Mountains and caves figure a great deal in the stories. You think about the Buddha's travels, the Prophet Muhammad, Jesus in the wilderness, going out to some place and descending back into the world with a message. Is
Can I just ask you? Do you think, to what extent? I mean, the Theosophists came around this time. It's almost like you think that the intellectual climate in Europe, people were thinking, we've killed God, what are we going to do? So they will start looking to the east to see if they can find
There's a lot of that. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Theosophy is very interesting in itself. I mean, Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, who was the founder of it, extraordinary character. Quite amazing. Was kind of a left Russia and created this kind of quasi-religion, which was very pervasive at the time, to the extent that she kind of appears in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, doesn't she? Madame Sosostris. But Blavatsky, yeah, she was inventing many of these ideas about Tibet in particular. Tibet was a place of magic and mystery, to the extent that, you know, in the early years of Nazi intellectuals, they sent expeditions to Tibet to find these mystical cities where the Aryans originally came from, you know.
Yeah.
So there was definitely this fascination with that which was non-European, which Said called Orientalism, which is another very problematic term. So the fact that Nietzsche drew from something outside the European tradition was significant. It was part of his break from Wagner as well, who was so rooted in German nationalism. Nietzsche had no real time for German nationalism at all. He didn't really like nationalism. It was too restrictive. For him, it was an effect of nihilism, ultimately, for reasons that we'll come to. But yeah, so the outsideness, the Persianness, the Zoroaster figure. Zoroaster becomes a figure he can use. He plays around with biblical language, and certainly would have heard a lot of that when he was a kid from his dad and so on. So he was very familiar with the Old and New Testament, and there's quite a lot of New Testament stuff going on there. And he deturns it, he you know, dismantles it and changes it and alters it, mutates it, deforms it, perverts it to his own ends in all kinds of ways. But it begins with this rather odd media res, as I say in literary terms, you know, in the middle of the action. He's been up a mountain for 10 years. What he's been doing up the mountain, I'm not entirely sure, but this is, I guess, what mystics do, contemplating on something. One thing we do discover that he's had a couple of mates up there, but not human mates. There's an eagle and a snake, which visit him fairly frequently, who he sees again when he comes down. And at some point, he wakes up, sees the sun, and decides it's time to leave the mountain and come back amongst the people and convey his message, because now he has a message to convey. And this is what he does. And he goes down the mountain, and the first person he encounters is a hermit. And the hermit remembers when he went up the mountain. It must have been very strange around this region. And all these kind of anchorites and hermits all over the place. But they have this rather bizarre conversation about fire and gods and so on. But you get the idea of the death of God there already. The hermit has effectively given up his relationship with the human because he loves the human, to devote himself to God. And then Zarathustra quietly says to himself, but doesn't he realize God is dead? So you know that this is going to be a theme that's going to continue throughout. Then he walks into this town. And I mean, I try to imagine this. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to stage this or film it. Maybe you have, but it's such a strange scenario. I can imagine it as a 60s psychedelic film or something like that. Probably work. This figure walks into a marketplace where there's lots of throngs of people around, and it's called the Motley Cow.
Have you seen the Holy Mountain?
Yeah, I was thinking of that. Yeah, that kind of. What's his name? Jaruzelski. What's his name? The filmmaker.
Jodorowsky.
Yeah, Jodorowsky. That's it. Yes, that would work. And it's probably influential on him as well. But, yeah, and I They're right. The Motley Cow, the name itself, some scholars have claimed it's a reference to the city of Thebes in Greece, which apparently roughly translated would come out as something like the Motley Cow. And the city of Thebes in ancient Greece is significant for being central to so many myths, including famously the myth of Oedipus and Antigone, Oedipus Rex, who blinds himself because he's had sex with his mother and killed his father and all this. And it's very central to the Nietzschean, positive Nietzschean view of tragedy in both of tragedy. Sophocles he likes, Euripides he doesn't because he thinks he's decadent. So it may be connected to that possibly, but it's a significant name undoubtedly because Nietzsche thought like that for him. So he's in this town and he immediately announces, I bring the Overman, the Übermensch, which is again an odd thing to do. So the themes are announced pretty early, and within the first few sections, and the sections are quite short, we have pretty much all the major elements, maybe not all of them, but most of them, including the last man, which is another figure who's quite important. The Übermensch, the Overman or Superman or superhuman or whatever, is contrasted with the final person, the final human, however it's translated, quite significantly. But what happens first is this whole strange performance after Zarathustra has announced the death of God. After Zarathustra has been effectively laughed out, not out of town yet, but they don't take him seriously anyway. They're much more interested in the rope dancer or tightrope walker. It translates as rope dancer because dancing is very significant to Nietzsche as well as a symbol of things. I mean, again, like the whole question of pity, it has to be said that when you delve into Nietzsche's biography, it kind of amused those who knew him that he was so down on pity, because he was very self-piteous in his everyday life. And he venerated dancing all the time, but he couldn't dance. Maybe that was the reason.
Just on the subject of pity and compassion, I got the impression that Nietzsche didn't approve of it only because if the Bible tells you to be compassionate, and that's the only reason you're being compassionate, that's not compassion, is it? That's just weakness and hypocrisy.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is pretty much right, because he's not totally consistent. But authentic compassion is something that comes from strength. It's something you give of yourself, not because you've been told to do, and certainly not because you expect anything back. I think that's very important. Elsewhere, later on, he talks a lot about generosity of self. And this is very important. Against all the odds, you're still generous of self without any expectation of return. So it's a pursuit of the perfect gift in that sense. And compassion is a gift of strength in that sense. But yeah, compassion from the weak is not a good thing as far as he's concerned. I mean, the dancing metaphor is, I don't know, it's kind of interesting.
I've been kind of going through a similar experience myself, actually, about the idea of compassion in the last couple of days. And I've been having a running theme about how it's kind of like I am sort of on the same page that you can't really save anybody else, and that you can only really save yourself. That's my kind of thinking at the moment.
Well, in a sense, I mean, one of the things that Nietzsche elsewhere says, and he borrows this from a Roman poet called Pindar, is become who you truly are. This is something that a lot of people have picked up on, but of course you've got to know who you truly are first. And you can't help other people until you've helped yourself. In that sense, I suppose you could argue that there was something in that. But yeah, I mean, compassion is a really important thing for the reasons we talked about. It's so central to Western culture and often so hypocritically applied as well. And hypocrisy is certainly one thing that Nietzsche is constantly attacking. So that's one area, but the dancing element is one that there's a lot been written about. Dancing is very important. Dancing is a way of, we talk about expressionist dance as a kind of, jokey way now, but in a sense, that's what he's doing a lot of the time. It's about the body. It's about writing with the body. It's about creating with the body. Clearly, it's something he couldn't do very well. And Nietzsche does venerate a lot of things that he wasn't personally able to do. And what's important here in the Dionysian principle is his ability to embrace his own impotence in regard to these things while still celebrating them. This is a kind of self-overcoming, which is very central to his thinking all the way through his life. And you find this kind of weaves in and out symbolically of pretty much everything he writes from the gay science onwards. This idea of self-overcoming, whether through dance or through a complex attitude to compassion or whatever. In this case, what we have is the symbolism of the rope. And here, again, he's borrowing from Zarathustra, who talks about a bridge between the fires of hell and the light of heaven that the individual who chooses correctly has to cross. So it's fairly dramatic, kind of fiery light imagery, and the tablets that remain of Zarathustra's teaching. And so he's borrowing from that, but then adapting it, because this particular bridge or rope is between the ape and the Übermensch, ultimately. And we, human beings, he claims, are the rope. This is the kind of imagery he's putting forward. And that actually in this period is pretty radical. There's nobody else coming up with that kind of stuff.
It leads me to ask, with the Zarathustra, why do you think he's writing? What do you think he hopes to achieve by writing?
Say again, don't miss that. What does he think? What?
With Zarathustra, what do you think he hopes to achieve? Is he hoping to have some effect on the culture.
What, in the village?
No, with Nietzsche. Why is Nietzsche writing Zarathustra?
Why is he writing Zarathustra? Right. Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, Nietzsche is hoping to have some kind of effect. Yeah, definitely. He wants to have an effect. He has a message that he needs to convey to people to tell them what the future is going to be like. He's driven to do that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah. Like Zarathustra, something happened in the mountain. He had to come down and tell people. It's a crisis, a moment of crisis. Crisis in the original sense of the break, which we get critic from as well, Crisius, the break, the breach. And he had his own crisis, obviously, having to leave Basel University in a professorship, the loss of status that was obviously quite difficult for him, because while he may not have valued status in itself, it supported him materially and in a lot of other ways. Suddenly he's on his own with a very small amount of money. He's got that at least, wandering around Europe. So there was a crisis. And he has to come back and tell us what he learned from this moment of crisis, in a sense. So there is a sense of autobiography. I mean, he never denied it. It's not, it's not a blasphemy to claim that with Nietzsche. But it's what he's claiming. I mean, this idea of the ape to the Übermensch is he'd read some Darwin. He was aware of and you find that the references to natural selection are littered throughout the work in this period. But he didn't read it very well, which is surprising, really, because Paul Ray, who was his best mate for quite a while, had translated some Darwin and written about Darwin fairly effectively. But we had to think about the response to Darwin in this period. Darwin's thinking absolutely revolutionized Europe in a way that was far more dramatic and immediate than Nietzsche. Nietzsche's day came later, as he himself realized. When he says, "I came too early," Zarathustra, in a sense, he's preempting that. It was a long time before Nietzsche's real effects came into being. I mean, you could argue that the period in which he was embraced by the Nazis was clearly significant, but there was a period after that in which the Nazis dropped away and a different Nietzsche appeared. So he's looking forward as a philosopher of the future. Darwin is very much a thinker of that moment, though. Darwin's theory of natural selection, the idea put about publicly and popularly that we were descended from the same creatures as apes and monkeys, was such a massive shock to a predominantly Christian society.
The social Darwinists that were around the early 20th century, were they affected but influenced by Nietzsche's ideas?
Some of them definitely were.
The rope, and man is the rope. Yeah. And it's an evolution from ape to the overman. So somehow trying to socially condition yourself so as to overcome yourself, humanity overcome itself and become better,
this is where so much of the thinking went kind of awry after his death, and largely because of Elizabeth Nietzsche, but also because of George Bernard Shaw, has to be said. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Man and Superman, which is very much based on his reading of Nietzsche. And Shaw was a socialist, he was also a socialist who was quite into eugenics, he's pretty mixed. But his version of the Übermensch it's not completely wrong, but it's designed for a kind of, matinee audience in theatres in London,
Are we looking at some sort of transhumanism, is it?
Ultimately, you get someone like Keith Ansel Pearson, who's written about this, who takes the transhuman Nietzsche as his theme. Yeah, I mean, almost certainly that's right. Now, the point about social Darwinism is important too. Darwinist natural selection in its purest form is chance. It's like Schopenhauer's will, it's not going anywhere. It's not like things lead to the wonder of the human, or anything beyond that. It's not gradually improving. It can easily go the other way. And this is perfectly put by H.G. Wells in his reflection on Darwin in The Time Machine, in which human beings evolve into two completely separate creatures, one of which looks like a degeneration. We could just as easily degenerate as progress, according to this particular vision. And there's nothing within the process of evolution that means we're going to improve or get more beautiful or clever or anything like that. But social Darwinists didn't go with that. They took a different version of Darwin. Some of them mixed it with a bit of Nietzsche and got that wrong too, on the understanding that there was something driving us to a gradual progression towards something great. Yeah.
Sort of putting historical purposiveness in
teleology. To be philosophical, teleology, that there was an end to all this. We're going somewhere. And this is something that was borrowed very much from the Judeo-Christian tradition, because, you know, most cultures have a pretty cyclical view of history. And this is true also in many religious systems, in Hinduism and the Maya system, for example. Things just circle in massive circles sometimes in small circles of the year or the day or the month. But Christianity and Judaism brought in this linear version where we go somewhere, the Day of Judgment. And that becomes borrowed in secular terms by Marx and others to talk about a future society, utopia.
There was a writer in the 30s. I'm trying to think of his name.
The first one?
Sorry?
When was this done?
In the 30s.
30s.
I'm trying to think of his name. Henry Miller's writes about him. And apparently everyone throughout, you know, everyone had his books, from the lowliest butler to the highest prince or whatever.
What, English writer, German writer?
I think he was German. Anyway, point is, he had this, what's his name? Spengler.
Oh, Spengler, yeah.
And he had a theory of that societies, sort of cyclic theory, that societies reach their apogee.
Well, it's more parabolic than cyclic. You know, societies rise and then fall. And he thought that European society was heading for its peak, and then it's going to go down and then move into another age, go up again. Yeah, and Spengler was a massively influential person, and also a great adherent of the great man theory. And, you know, he begins in the 1920s talking about how, you know, the great men of the last century, and includes Marx and Nietzsche in that, are not appearing now. We degenerated, and the whole of culture will continue to degenerate, and then there will be another rise. You know, that was certainly important. But it did kind of go somewhere, that theory. Same as Hegel. Nietzsche's doesn't. Darwin's doesn't. Well, Nietzsche's doesn't. Hang on, let me get that straight. It does potentially, but not in that way. You know, the Übermensch is not some sort of evolutionary development. It's not some historical development. It's a development within a facet of self-overcoming. So it has a different kind of pattern, if that makes sense. But yeah, the social Darwinists did believe in that, and they led to eugenics and all kinds of things. The idea we could perfect the human being, make us better and better. And some transhumanists still buy into that. Maybe not in quite the same way, but transhumanism is partly, in some cases, about gradually augmented the body to enable us to live forever, or for a long time anyway, and be clever and so on. And yeah, Nietzsche and transhumanism have rubbed up against each other at various points, definitely.
There's just one other thing I need to ask.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of a bit skeptical sometimes.
Why not?
As you say, his books, he had to retire from his job. Mm-hmm. His books weren't selling very well, particularly. No. So he didn't have much money. No. I'm inclined to wonder to what extent he was being deliberately sensationalist or provocative in order to sell more books.
Well, if he was, it didn't work.
Right.
No, I don't think so. I think he because he self-analyzes all the way. You have a pretty good picture of what's going on. You know, yeah, you're right. I mean, he's broke. He's lost his job. He's going blind. He's not getting any sex. He's got no one he's very close to apart from a few friends. He's not having a good time, is he? But he's still producing all these books. And
yeah.
I mean, you know, I don't think they're meant to be bestsellers. I don't think they were designed for that somehow. I mean, the gay science, you know, this is just a selection of snippets, you know, and human to human, which nobody wrote like that. You know, then Voltaire had written like that, and he revered Voltaire at that point. You know, those of you who've done Voltaire with me a couple of years ago will remember Candide and a few others like, what's the name? Yeah. So, I mean, the aphoristic style has been done before, but it was unusual. Then not completely unknown. Samuel Butler did it in this country as well, in English writing, and he's very interesting as well. And he was a kind of post-Darwinian, but he wasn't writing for the marketplace, and he has a lot to say about that. He had a very uncomfortable relationship with a lot of publishers.
Erewhon, Samuel Butler.
Erewhon, yeah, and the Book of Machines, yeah. He's a significant writer as well from that period, but you know, it's another thing. But yeah, I mean, actually, Samuel Butler and Nietzsche come together, and some modernist writers in England, like Wyndham Lewis, who was a great fan of both of them and incorporated their ideas. They're sort of parallel. But anyway, Nietzsche's relationship with Darwin, we'll get into a bit more of that later, but it's complex. You know, he read Darwin, but he didn't necessarily read him very faithfully. And part of that, you could say, is partly Darwin's fault as well, because sometimes he weakened a bit, you know, because he was so worried about, you know, the effect he was having on Christians within his own family as well as the world generally. But the Übermensch is not an evolutionary development in those terms. That's the point. It's a way of becoming who you truly are. It's something that is potentially there within you if you're a certain kind of person. That's what he's trying to sell us anyway. Now, how far you can take that seriously and whether it works is another issue. So he spends the rest of the book either proselytizing and sermonizing about this, that, and the other. A lot of it critical of all the other things going on and culturally, or just, you know, kind of vanishing off into these very strange riddles, which take quite a lot of time to dismantle and unravel.
Would you say that here, like a search for authenticity is like a kind of proto-existentialist, or like, and that also that search for authenticity was also a large part of what it means by overcoming, like somehow reaching for the true you, the true who you are. You know, so you aren't guided by the marketplace, you aren't guided by hypocrisy, you aren't guided by doing what other people do just for because other people are doing it.
Yeah,
so, you know,
that's certainly true. I mean, that comes through very strongly in his references to the marketplace. And later on in The Flies of the Marketplace, when things called about the poisonous flies in the markets, he had he was very suspicious of capitalism, which is another reason he wasn't taken on by liberals and conservatives that much. So yeah, the existential side of him is really important, and clearly he was a massive influence on some existentialists. Camus wrote about him very well. Bern Magnus, who's one of his interpreters, described the doctrine of eternal recurrence as the existential imperative, which we can unpack that a little bit, because I'm going to sort of conclude this session by talking about eternal recurrence, which is the main idea. But I mean, what happens anyway in the marketplace? He has this experience of the crowd not being ready. He's too early. Then the tightrope walker walks across, and this image of the path to the Übermensch via the human is being portrayed. But what happens? Does anyone remember what happens then? This kind of jester, this buffoon, leaps out of a tower and jumps over him on the tightrope. This poor tightrope walker, laughing maniacally, and he falls off. It's very strange.
What is that? Joy in life? Joy, exuberance?
I don't know. There's something quite sinister about this jester, because he meets him again afterwards. So the tightrope walker falls and he's dying, and he's terrified because he thinks he's going to go to hell, because he's, well, for whatever reasons. And Zarathustra assures him that there is no heaven and hell, there is no God, you're just going to disappear into oblivion. And so he can die happy. I mean, that's the idea. The buffoon is just buffooning around the town. And everyone starts to ignore Zarathustra by this point. So he picks up the body of this guy, the corpse, throws him over his shoulder, and decides to take him out of the town to bury him. So after having arrived in this town and announced the Übermensch, watch the tightrope performance, the death of God as well. Watch the tightrope performance. He's now picking up the corpse of the tightrope walker and walking out of town, which is kind of strange. He's stopped by the jester, who happens to be hanging around on the edge of town at this point, who tells him he's very lucky to get away, because if the crowd had taken him any more seriously, they might have killed him, effectively. So who is this jester? I mean, this jester was really scary. Then he runs into a bunch of grave diggers, and they're very, they mock him and say, well, you're doing our job for us, aren't you? Now, clearly they represent something, these figures, don't they? Grave diggers are usually assumed to be historians, and Nietzsche's deforming of the versions of history that they have in the academy are being attacked. You know, this is how it's often read anyway. But the jester's something else. The jester is very strange. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts about who the jester is.
Yeah, I took the jester to be Zarathustra, really, in some variant.
Yeah.
I was quite disappointed that he dumped the body in such a perfunctory manner. I was hoping that we would have this whole Faulkner-esque carrying around of this corpse.
That would have been quite, there must be another version where he does that all the way through. So it's rotting on his shoulder.
Yeah, something kind of Sam Beckett about this, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. But he gets to the end of town and he finds another hermit, doesn't he? Because he suddenly decides he's really hungry. He's really peckish. You know, he's been on the mountain for 10 years. He's come down, hasn't had anything to eat. And he's been through this experience and he's got a corpse on his back. So it's so odd. You know, I'm really hungry now. And he happens to come across a hermit who seems to have food. Lankerite.
The hunger and the corpse and the need for connection and the way that connection is sort of contingent on the rules of charity. It seems to be a point of negotiation where Zarathustra has been talking to a lot of animals, and then he talks to a lot of people who might as well be animals because he's not really getting anything from them. And then he starts sort of talking to variants of himself, you know, corpses and jesters and whatnot else. He spends a lot of time talking, but in the end, that life force, that hunger, predominates, and he is able to put the corpses down.
Well, he puts the corpse down, but he's very keen to protect the corpse from the wolves. There are obviously wolves around as well. And I've wondered about those wolves a long time. But I don't know quite what they mean. But you're right, yeah. So it could be an example of the life force resuming in him. But it's also a return to the body as well. Nietzsche reminding us of the body. As he says, I mean, he has a lot of attacks on the ascetics, the people, you know, the men usually, but the anorexics, the people who refuse to eat for holy reasons. You know, it's quite important to feed the body for him, but it is quite hallucinatory. There's no doubt about it. I mean, another thing is that the second hermit, is very keen to feed the dead body as well as Zarathustra, isn't he? So you and your friend must both eat. I know he's dead, but he must eat too. So from that perspective, you would see him as a corollary of Zarathustra as well, the corpse, would you, Karen?
It's an example of the idiocy of following rules, isn't it? That charity requires that anybody that knocks on your door asking for food is fed, even if that person is a corpse. I
hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. I mean, that's just what I took from it anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, quite possibly. I mean, that hasn't happened to me recently. No one's knocked on the door with a corpse on the shoulder asking for food. I'm not sure how I'd respond.
Just wait for Halloween, I say.
Yeah, you got plans, have you? Anyway, he does eventually kind of dispose of the corpse. Perhaps there isn't that much ceremony about it, but he does. Then he goes on, and then he has various visions. Animals occur. First of all, there's the eagle and the snake, who are his old friends from up the mountain, who clearly symbolize all kinds of things. Soaring. This whole business of going up and down and going forward and backwards constantly recurs here. And eagles clearly soar. Snakes are traditionally symbols of all kinds of things: wisdom, sexuality, medicine, all manner of things. But they're clearly important to the symbolism of Zarathustra. But the going up and going over and going down as well, which is something that is puzzling. You know, he talks about the crossing the bridge, the tightrope, as a going down and going over. And yet there are images of ascent as well. And we tend to think of ascent as going up as a good thing, as a positive, generally, don't we? You know, people talk about getting high and, you know, that heaven is up there. There are all kinds of reasons why directionality is quite important in terms of existential and spiritual and other kinds of non-natural cartography. But going down seems to be significant for him too. You go down to go over. It seems to imply getting deeper into things sometimes. That's certainly how it appears. It may be an indirect reference to the old tradition of catabasis, the idea of going down to the underworld, which is something that recurs in Western literature at various points. Odysseus and Achilles and Homer both go down to the underworld at a certain point, and in Virgil's Aeneas, he goes down to the underworld, and Dante, of course, goes down to the underworld. So maybe this is an aspect of it. And of course, around the time Nietzsche's writing, so does Alice and Lewis Carroll's fables. So going underground is kind of interesting. But what it actually means in terms of Nietzsche has never been quite clear to me. Quite a lot of people have written about this.
I always took it going up and then going down. Going up, there are phases in our lives where perhaps we're more contemplative or meditative.
Yeah.
So going up, remaining elevated. And then after a period of doing that, whether it's 1 year or 2 years or however long, then you come back down and you rejoin life as it's lived. You know, it's more ordinary kind of phase or cycle. And maybe that's when you go back down to pass on your message or what you've learned or it may not even be that. It might be just returning to a more ordinary way of life.
It could be something like that, being grounded after elevation. I mean, we associate that also with being depressed as well. So that could be despair. Yeah.
Mountain climbers have to spend quite a lot of time going down in order to reach another peak. The ultimate upward trajectory involves lots of negotiation and going back on yourself and going up and down, doesn't it? And he was a big fan of mountains.
You like to walk in mountains. I mean, maybe, yeah, but the going down is clearly important in the whole process from the ape to the Übermensch somehow.
We grow up, don't we?
We grow up, yeah.
Then we decline.
Certainly, certainly seems to be the way. And you look up to people and look down on people, you know. And, yeah, up and down, backwards and forwards, side to side. I mean, all these things are really important in the way we consider the universe. So I know it's something to dwell on and mull on, because it's the whole of Zarathustra is full of these references to direction.
I'd just ask, what were your thoughts on the jester that you mentioned that leapt over the tightrope walk? What were your thoughts on who that? I wonder whether it would perhaps represent the irrational or the irrational in the world, in that things can happen that, or no matter, you know, I suppose the simplest phrase is, you know, the best laid plans of mice and men, you know, the best, whatever your plans are, however you project into the future, things just can happen like that.
That would probably make a certain amount of sense, because chance is quite central. I mean, whereas you can view Schopenhauer in the end, and I'll come back to this, but the will is the will to nothing in the end, because it doesn't go anywhere. Nietzsche's more concerned with the will to chance, to accepting the chance and random nature of the universe, to accepting contingency, which is partly what eternal recurrence is about. So that would make sense, yeah. I mean, we often associate that kind of figure with a trickster or Loki or whatever, and the tarot obviously has the cards have their jokers, and it possibly means all kinds of things, yeah. But that's quite feasible, yeah. Randomness, I like that.
Loki in the Ring cycle was the one god that had sort of intelligence, a kind of self-conscious intelligence, as opposed to being buffeted about by passions. You know, the other gods, Wotan.
He's cunning.
And self-conscious.
Nietzsche, like cunning, he writes about cunning quite a lot. Yeah, that's quite feasible. I never thought about that in Wagnerian terms. I mean, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, maybe. I'm sure there are books to be written about the jester. Maybe they've been written. I haven't found them yet. But no, that's interesting. I'll look into this though. The next phase I'm going to get to we're getting to the end, near the end now. It's the animal bit. You know, I mean, he sees the eagle and the lion. Then he has this strange metamorphosis: the camel, the lion, and the child. And this is something that establishes a certain routine for the rest of the book. That you have sermons on the despisers of the body, on reading and writing, on pleasure and pain, and so on. And then you have these allegorical asides. And Nietzsche liked his animal parables, I guess, and that's very much part of German and Central European thinking anyway. Kafka does the same with his animal fables, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot we could say about this. I mean, I'll come back to this next week. We only got 10 minutes. I just want to go back to the eternal recurrence thing, because it's really quite important. So I'm just going to read that section out. This is from the Gay Science, and it's quite short. The heaviest weight, Gay Science 341. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, and will have to live it again and innumerable times again, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small or great in your life must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider, this moonlight between the trees, even this moment and I myself, The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? If this thought gained power over you, as you are, it would transform and possibly crush you. The question in each and everything, do you want this again and innumerable times again, would lie on your actions as the heaviest weight. Oh, how well disposed would you have to be to become to yourself and to life, to long for nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. Incipit tragedia, in, the birth of tragedy. So, this is the existential experiment, effectively, which connects with what you were saying earlier, Mohammed. The existential side, the existential imperative. It's a what if. Nietzsche, it's generally assumed, is not making a statement about the way the cosmos is. Though he could be, as we mentioned with multiverse theory, this is not
sounds to me like reincarnation.
I mean, a lot of different ways you could feed into this idea, but the fundamental notion.
The object of, the idea of reincarnation is that you essentially perfect yourself and you don't have to come back again, isn't it?
Well, that isn't what happens in this one, isn't it? This is Groundhog Day in which everything stays the same. Except for your response to it inwardly. That's it. That's the only thing where you have any choice.
Well, what happens if you do perfect yourself and become the Übermensch?
Well, I suppose that's, well, you can embrace it, I guess. But if you don't, you have to embrace that equally. I mean, that's the point. Whatever happens, the amor fati, the love of fate, has to be the most important thing. The existential thing, I will affirm this, whatever it is. My life is absolute shit, but I'm going to affirm it anyway.
Which he had to do himself. He was an exemplar of that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess the idea of eternal recurrence, it could be that, this is the only life that we have. And time, perhaps, we often think of it, maybe in the modern Western world, kind of as linear. It moves from past to future. But maybe we only have the present. We only have this kind of the heavy weight of present. I mean, strangely enough, Milan Kundera talks in the unbearable lightness of being, but the other way around. That somehow, it's a light thing that we don't have parallel lives, and we can compare and contrast. We only have the one life, and this is the lightness of being, he calls it.
Yeah.
Nietzsche calls it.
This is the interesting opposition, because Nietzsche calls it the greatest weight, and Kundera, Milan Kundera in the novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, says, no, what if that doesn't repeat? What if this is all we've got? It's completely fleeting and transient, which is the opposite option. And, there's some writer, I can't remember his name, who wrote a book called The Unbearable Lightness of Being in Aberystwyth subsequently. So, but there's humour. I was going to get to the spirit of gravity. We haven't quite got there. We'll pick up on that next week. But laughter is where you supposedly end up. It's the only way to deal with these things for Nietzsche. We haven't really got time to get into the spirit of gravity, though. But I think as an existential idea, it's very important, but the opposite is important too. So the idea of eternal recurrence is one thing you have to face, but the idea of everything just vanishing is also the other. We looked at last week, this idea there's a great abyss behind us and a great abyss ahead of us, and we're a little short lighted path in between these two abysses, and that's it. So how do we feel about that? For Nietzsche, well, what if you're constantly crossing that path? When you get to the end, you go back to the beginning, which is quite horrible, actually, really. In a way, if you know it's happening. I mean, is that like Groundhog Day isn't quite like that, because he changes his attitude, doesn't he? But no. It's an existential test.
It's also horrible to think in terms of linear time that you're awake and alive now, but the almost infinite time, though it's perhaps not infinite, that will carry on for after you've gone.
Yeah. The
length, the abyss of time that holds,
infinite,
and you're never going to exist again. You're never going to happen again. It's almost unbearable.
Well, that I mean, existentially, that is the thing that is to be confronted. And that's what Heidegger takes from Nietzsche, that confronting this nothingness is the essence of being towards death, which is the essence of authenticity. That only once you actually confront this can you become authentic. And the existentialists draw on this idea as well. The meaninglessness and emptiness of the void. You have to find your position within that and realize you're just a brief flash. So how do you celebrate that briefness, and how do you act within it? And I mean, in a sense, Nietzsche, along with Kierkegaard, set this whole ball rolling. Maybe there are a few others in the past, like Pascal, but you know, this is where we are. What do we do? You know, it's a quite a powerful thing to think about, really, isn't it? Especially if you're having a really bad time. If your life is quite pleasant, you might think, oh, well, I don't mind, I could probably do this again. But if it's really bad, and a lot of people's is, I don't know how you could handle it, really. It's very difficult.
It's bad enough when it's mentally bad.
Yeah.
You know, like you're going through despair, you're going through, or even possibly clinical things.
Yes.
But it must be so much worse even than that when it's physical as well. Your body is degenerating, your body's getting worse, and you've got conditions. And
most human life, most of the time, historically has been about misery. I mean, this is the point they're making.
Laughter. I mean, the Buddha.
Laughter is one way of dealing with it, possibly. Yeah.
I would claim that Nietzsche's got a kind of a collective consciousness, that the sort of the amor fati thing means that my fate is inextricably linked to yours. Everyone's fate, everywhere, everywhen, and the amor fati means an acknowledgement of that. In other words, shit happens, but it happens to all of us, and sometimes it's not so bad.
Right. Okay. That's certainly one way of dealing with it. Yeah. That's actually quite a nice note to conclude on. Anyway, it could be far worse, couldn't it? All right. So yeah. Well, what we'll do next week, we'll continue from the spirit of gravity into why I am so clever. And I'll put up a few possible things that people might get around to reading. How about that? Should I stop the recording, Karen, or will it do it automatically?
To my knowledge, it will do it automatically when the meeting ends.
Stops. Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to end my bit, but shall I leave it on so people can chat, or I don't know what you want to do? It's up to you.
Turn it off, Charlie, because we need with the gigabytes. We don't want the recording to go on too long.
That's true. That's all right. I'll see you all next week then. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
See ya.